Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hi, everybody. Tom Woods here. It is episode 2624 of The Tom Woods Show, and I'm delighted once again to welcome my old professor. I don't mean to say old, but in the old days when I was an undergraduate at Harvard and I took 20th century Russia, I took it with Dr. Vladimir Brovkin, who is our guest today. And his most recent work is From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, Russia in Search of Its Identity, 1913 to 2023. And obviously, this is a topic of perennial interest where everybody has an interest in the authentic history of Russia because it's in our headlines every single day. So, Dr. Brovkin, welcome back.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, I thought today, now I realize that in covering a topic like this, we run the risk of being called all kinds of names. But I'll tell you something, that has never held me back in the past, and I'm not about to let it start now. So the first part of this episode, I'd like to spend talking about Putin himself. I'd like to know about who he is and what motivates him, and because the Western view is that he was a communist, and so he's just exchanged one form of authoritarianism for another. He has ambitions to reconstruct the old Soviet empire. There are a lot of things that we hear in the West. So I'd like to know how true any of that is, or what you think in your study of the matter is a more accurate way of describing him. And in your work, you have said, since he's been in power for nearly a quarter century, that you like to divide that time of his tenure into three separate sections for analytical purposes. So why don't we start at the beginning, start around the year 2000? Who is he?
Yes, let me take a slightly different approach to this. Both Putin and I were born in Leningrad, USSR. So his parents lived through the siege of Leningrad, and mine did too. This was a time of hunger. This was a time when hundreds of thousands of people just dropped dead of hunger. And I think that this is a kind of something in common, something that I feel is in common. And that means that I can sort of try to understand the way he looks at the country and the people and its history. And I could also see we're pretty much the same generation. I could sort of see where he comes from. Now, in my youth, I was very much against, I'm still against the communist regime and against Stalinism and against all this. But I also understand that there were people at that time in the 1950s and 60s who were genuine communists. And what I mean by the word genuine is that they preferred not to look at the crimes of Stalin era. They preferred not to look at what I found out in the archives about the true face of Bolshevism, but they looked at the achievements of Soviet regime, at the education, at the suffering of people after the war, that things were getting better in the 50s and 60s, and they were. And he was like a young man in the early 60s, which is the same generation as I am. So he went to judicial faculty of the Leningrad University. I actually went to the language department. And then he was offered a job in intelligence, which to the people who were not against the system was a privilege. It was a very prestigious career that lay again ahead of him. So when they say he was in KGB, this is not exactly correct. KGB was a huge organization. Part of it was spying domestic services like FBI perhaps, or some kind of form of political control inside the country. But the other side was foreign intelligence. So he was stationed in a friendly country, which is GDR. So it was not really a spy business that he was on. It was intelligence gathering together with the East Germans on West Germany and NATO and whatever else he was. In other words, I don't see anything particularly damaging in his reputation and record when he was so-called KGB, when he was in foreign intelligence. Now, after that, when the Soviet Union collapsed, what distinguished the so-called KGB people, or those that were connected with the establishment, was that there were two types, and I also described this in my book. One were those that used their position during Soviet times to make money, and they used the Gorbachev times to become entrepreneurs. So a lot of Russian bankers actually are former KGB officials or Komsomol or party officials. These are the people who, during the late Soviet period, were accumulating wealth, power, connections. Connections are very important, not what you have, but who you know. And they became entrepreneurs and they started privatizations and all kinds of stuff. Many of them have this career path, like Berezovsky and Khodorkovsky and many others. Now, the other side of the former KGBs were the ones who accepted the new reality of capitalism and private enterprise and the new reality, and they joined in as experts. And this is what Putin did with Sobchak. Sobchak has an impeccable reputation of a liberal, of a westernizer. Leningrad in the 1990s was supposed to be an example of westernizing, friendly to the West kind of political regime. Despite the fact that there was lots of crime and corruption, all kinds of things, this was all over the Soviet Union, Russia. So Putin comes here and makes his big first climb to power by association with Sobchak, the mayor of Leningrad, St. Petersburg, the second most important city. And then, because he has these connections in the intelligence service, Primakov, the head of the FSB, becomes foreign minister. And he takes his protege, which happens to be Putin, it's partly a chance, to replace him and become the head of the FSB. So that means that he's at the top of his original career, and now his former boss is the foreign minister. And that means that when they're looking for people who could be a potentially prime minister under Yeltsin, Putin is one of the candidates. And then in the book, I explain why of all the candidates, and there were plenty, and Yeltsin was changing them one after another. Why they chose Putin? They chose Putin because Putin was acceptable to everyone. He was acceptable to Primakov and the power bloc, that is to say, the intelligence, the party. So because he was reliable, he was a friend of Primakov. He was acceptable to the nationalists, or those who were go Russia go, because he took a very, very rough and tough approach to the terrorists, to the Chechnya conflict, the separatists in the Caucasus. And he was acceptable to the westernizers, most important, because of his connection to Sobchak, which means everybody would be sure that there's going to be no reconsideration of privatization, no rollback to Soviet times. So he had the credentials of a westernizer, a credential of a patriot, and the credentials that he is a reliable person who has connections in very high places. And of course, his most important contribution is that the Yeltsin family was not afraid that he is going to expropriate what they had stolen during years in power. That's how he becomes the prime minister and then the president.
I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but only because I know it's on a lot of people's minds. Nikki Haley in the United States has repeatedly claimed that Putin has openly declared his intention to reconstruct the old Soviet empire. And I can't find him saying that. Is that simply an invention of the Western imagination, in your opinion?
Yes, but this is a very complex issue. Let me try to explain it. It's not a matter of yes and no, because this is a much more complex. Obviously, there's no question about restoring the empire, but what about the Soviet Union? And what Putin himself explained in many times when they asked him this question is that it's impossible to restore it, but it's very bad that it collapsed. And what he means by that is that it didn't have to collapse. It was really three Communist Party members, the three communist leaders of Belarus, of Ukraine, and of Russia, got together and declared that they leave the Soviet Union. And there was no referendum. There was no particularly, in fact, there was a referendum that Gorbachev organized half a year earlier, and 75% of the people who participated in the Gorbachev referendum voted to preserve the Soviet Union. So the legitimacy of quitting the Soviet Union is questionable. So in that sense, it didn't have to happen. Moreover, there are people in Russia who say, basically, if these three people, leaders of these three republics, decided to split, one day they could just the same way assemble in the same place and say, we decide to get back together. And this is none of business of the West or of the British to tell the Russians and the Ukrainians what they should do. Should they be together or should they be not? In other words, it was an internal matter. And this is how a lot of people in Russia view this. So it's not something, it was not an international treaty like after World War II that said that Germany will be this and that in these borders. It was simply three republics of the 15 decided to split out of the Soviet Union. Fine, they did. But why is it criminal to think that if they get together, that would be good? There's nothing particularly offensive about that. Just like if Texas decided to split from the United States. So what, is that criminal to think that it shouldn't? Or if it did, so it came back? I mean, that's pretty much the logic.
Your old friend Woods here is about to save you a bundle. I'd like to tell you about my friends at Federated Computer, who are changing the way businesses buy software. We all need software to run our business, but the best business software doesn't have to cost thousands of dollars each month. The typical Federated Computer customer saves 75% or more on their software bill and gets great software, top-notch customer service and support, and a software solution that is uniquely installed for your business without any surveillance or breaches of privacy. For example, if you use Google for email, Salesforce for CRM, Slack for team chat, ListMonkey for customer communications, and Airtable for data management, with a team of 10, you'd save $9,000 per year on software costs switching to Federated Computer. And what's wild is the cost of Federated Computer doesn't grow as your team grows. You can use your Federated Computer savings to grow your business rather than feed the woke Silicon Valley software companies. The Federated Computer team invented computing in the cloud. Now they're taking a hammer to the ridiculously high prices of business software and have many, many satisfied customers to prove they deliver. Federated Computer has been a longtime supporter of The Tom Woods Show, and they're offering 30% off their already low prices when you use coupon code WOODS. Go to www.federated.computer to begin to save 75% or more on your monthly software costs. That's www.federated.computer. Don't forget coupon code WOODS. These folks are going to do you a big, big favor. Check them out. The impression that we have in the West is that you would not want to be a political opponent of his because nasty things could happen to you. And people can cite specific names. What is the truth of the matter? And I have nothing invested in this either way. I don't have any Russian roots. I have no intention of living in Russia. I just want to know.
Yeah, okay. This is a good question. Let me put it this way. When he became president in 2000, there is this conversation that's reported in many books, which I also use in mine, that Berezovsky, who was one of the oligarchs very close to Yeltsin family, he told Putin, "You're gonna be in the driver's seat for a few years, and after that, we'll find a replacement for you." In other words, the political system that existed in the 1990s was that a group of oligarchs, that true oligarchs, those who had the money and the power, manipulated Yeltsin in whichever way they wanted, and he didn't even understand what they were doing, especially with IMF and finances and all kinds of bank rates and interest rates, etc. So Putin, when he came in, he put an end to this. And this is, I think, one of his greatest achievements. Russia is no longer governed by the oligarchs. No longer very rich men decide what's going to happen I remember I'm sorry, but I remember that when J.P. Morgan was told that President Roosevelt wanted to split up his monopoly, he said, "Who is this guy to tell me what to do?" So in the United States, there were also oligarchs, the robber barons, and they were doing all kinds of things the presidents had to accept. So there's nothing new about Russia. Putin put an end to this. And then he sent a message to the oligarchs: either you keep your money. I put it like this in the book: you keep your money, you stay out of politics. That was the rule. And those that kept out of politics still have all these factories that they privatized into their own pockets. They still are there. I don't want to mention names because this is going to get complicated, but they're still there. And those that resisted and tried to play politics and finance political parties and engage in all kinds of dissident activities, he didn't arrest them, he didn't shoot them. He found misdeeds and unpaid taxes and violations of this and violations of that. And so they had to quit, or they had to be nationalized, or they were squeezed out. So this was a polite and civilized way of getting rid of them. Now, as far as political opponents are concerned, the unwritten rule is you can criticize, but you cannot get your money from the West. If you do, you're out. I mean, there'll be all kinds of ways to push you out, to shut you down, and there's no way you can be engaged politically in Russia and receive money from USAID or whatever. So this was something that some people didn't understand, and they continued to, and then they were shut down, and then they start screaming, "Oh, there's suppression of free speech in Russia." Well, there is suppression of speech in Russia because you were getting your money from the United States. That's the same thing in Ukraine. Today, I heard the news yesterday that 50% of Ukrainian media are going to shut down because they lived on American money. So Putin stopped this business of American financing of media. And that's why many people consider this is a violation of free speech and free political activity. Now, but something that I must admit in terms of his so-called authoritarianism is that he didn't make it easy for those people who did try to run against him. He didn't make it easy. There was a communist candidate, and then they found all kinds of misdeeds or tax not paid. And this was, I think, a little bit too much, because he was a legitimate candidate from a legitimate political party that opposed him. And there shouldn't have been any of these steps that his people did to block him. But I must add to you that if the communists had won and had their own man as president, I think the West would have found it worse than Putin, because they would have started renouncing privatization. They would have tried to restore as much of the Soviet order as possible. And that's what they keep saying for the last 20 years. So I think in that sense, the West is lucky that he stayed in power rather than the communists. And the only real opposition party that exists in Russia, not counting little Western paid little intelligentsia groups and westernizers.
Let's move ahead to, let's say 2014 and talk about 2014 specifically, because there's controversy in the United States about to what extent did the U.S. government play a role in installing a pro-Western regime in Ukraine, because we have many people on in our country who say that the U.S. played a central role, and others who say this has all been exaggerated. You misunderstood Victoria Nuland's telephone call. What's your impression?
Yeah, I have no impression. I'm absolutely have the certainty that it was the United States organized the coup d'état from the very beginning to the very end, and it's not only Nuland. The reason I say that is because I had a long connection to Ukraine during my career. In the year 2000, I was part of the program that I used to go to Ukraine every 2 or 3 months organizing conferences and all kinds of research projects and all kinds of things. And I was constantly in touch with American embassy. And what they were doing already then, from today's perspective, it was like an introduction to the first color revolution in 2006. So the United States was very much interested in promoting what they believed was democracy. And that was understood as not the rule of the people, but the rule of the Western-friendly political groupings. That's what was understood by democracy. And they were sponsoring them, and they were giving them money, just like in Russia, except that in Russia, Putin shut it down. And they were promoting, but I must admit, there were many people in in Ukraine, who wanted to be a part of EU, who wanted the Western ways, just like in Russia. They wanted to have a democracy, to have friendship with the West, European Union membership. All that was genuine. The only thing that was not genuine is the actual physical takeover of the government, which was well organized by Bandera or nationalist Ukrainian groups who were perfectly well armed and were organized and supported. And it was a masterful political operation of seizing power. A color revolution, if you want, that was practiced in many other places. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But it was practiced in Tbilisi, and these days it's going on in Serbia and in many other places. So it was a coup d'etat. And Putin's reaction, this is what the West doesn't understand, was extremely reserved. There were people at that time who were saying, let's go and just take Kiev, or let's just take over. There was a plane carrying new Ukrainian leadership to the United States. Some actually military said, let's seize it. Let's just escort it back to Russia. Wanted to stop it and stop it in the bud. He didn't. He decided to go slow, to negotiate, to invite the European Security Committee, whatever this organization is called, to be observers. In other words, his behavior actually earned him a lot of anger from the Donbas people. One of their leaders is still in prison now because of his criticism of Putin when he said that Putin betrayed Donbas in 2014 by not incorporating it into Russia right there and then, as it was with Crimea. So it's all a matter of perspective. From many of the Russian nationalist perspective, Putin was too slow, too cautious, and too accommodating to the West.
Hey gang, here's how to never pay for a book again. Think of the hot issues of our day: gender theory, so-called, Ukraine, the Federal Reserve, or guns, or education, including how would a free society provide it? Well, I've got a free ebook on all of them from a dissident perspective. I've also got obliterations of the worldviews of Bernie Sanders and AOC. I've got a pretty darn good book on national divorce and a whole bunch more. I've got over a dozen, and you can pick whichever one you like, or you can have them all. It's up to you. Find them all at tomsfreebooks.com. In fact, the next time you're about to pull out your credit card to buy a book, think to yourself, wait a minute, didn't old Woods try to save me from this fate of endlessly throwing money at books? Head over to tomsfreebooks.com. Then what exactly is it? In fact, I think this is one of the questions that Tucker Carlson posed to him. What exactly then changed between 2014 and 2022 that he felt like war was justified in 2022, but not 2014?
Yeah, this is a good question. Well, what probably changed is that he hoped with the Minsk Accords to find a compromise. He was really very interested in keeping good relations with Germany. That means to say this with Angela Merkel and with France, and continue to have trade and access views to all kinds of things that trade benefited. There were a lot of Western investments in Russia, and he wanted to keep as much as possible, all of that. The compromise was that that Donbas gets autonomy, and serious autonomy with pretty much open frontiers to Russia, as all of Ukraine used to be. And that if European Union was interested in Ukraine as a member, there had to be a trade mechanism worked out so that Russia wouldn't lose out in terms of trade. And there were all kinds of schemes proposed as to how you could do it so that they could be associate member of EU and at the same time trade with Russia would continue. So what he hoped for is that the Minsk Accords compromise would work. That's what he hoped for, and that's what it didn't work. And just before the military operation in 2022, if you recall the way things developed, he gave a last chance. He invited Macron and the Germans to one more meeting of the Normandy format, as they said, and discuss, will they accept Minsk Accords? The answer was no. And the French and the Germans refused to make any pressure on the Ukrainians to comply with what they had signed. So it was clear that Minsk is dead. They don't want it. They don't want any autonomy. But even that was not enough to start this special military operation. What actually moved him to start it was the British naval exercises in September 2021. The British opened their own base in Ukraine, in Ochakov. And so that Putin had this kind of a vision that step by step, salami tactics, one more time, one more piece was incorporation of Ukraine into NATO. That was going on. Military exercises, American bases, special labs, all kinds of a growing presence and takeover by NATO infrastructure in Ukraine. I once opened up a map, U.S. installations in Ukraine in 2021. There were dozens. So Putin said, no, wait. He probably thought about it with his advisors and the military staff and decided we can't accept this. This has to stop, and this was the beginning of the special military operation. And as we know now, the purpose was not to overrun Ukraine, but to force Ukraine to respect Minsk Accords. And this is what they did in March. They signed that they would actually respect Minsk Accords. And then, as we all know, Bo Joe came and said, no, we're going to finance you as long as it takes. We keep on fighting, and the war continued. And that's what's been going on for 3 years.
Well, now we've got some kinds of talks going on, which would not have been possible under the previous administration.
Yes.
But it's hard to do this because in the U.S., even the idea of speaking to the Russians is so unthinkable to the existing establishment. It's vastly more unthinkable than it was speaking to a Soviet premier, even though any Soviet premier is worse than Putin.
Exactly.
But we had no hesitation talking to them. But it helps in this case that Trump is often immune to public opinion, or not public opinion, establishment opinion. And he seems intent on moving forward. But the issue is, what are the terms? Like, what exactly would a ceasefire amount to? So what do you think is the likelihood that some good will come of this?
It's a very complex question because, you see, Putin is not exactly, free to do whatever he wants. He also has to count with the public opinion and his army. And the Russian army has lost, some people say 200,000, maybe 300,000, but there were a lot of soldiers who died, and the question is for what? Obviously, Donbass is Russian, and there's no compromise whatsoever that would be a non-negotiable. So the 4 provinces that Putin announced, non-negotiable, that's there. But the discussion that's going on now in Russia is, what about Odessa? It's a Russian city. It was founded by the Russians. The Ukrainian government destroyed the monument to Catherine II, who actually founded that city at the end of the 18th century. What about Kharkov, which is a Russian city that Lenin gave to Ukraine just because there were no communists in Ukraine, and Kharkov is an industrial center, and he wanted to dilute Ukraine with Russian communist workers. And this is why Kharkov was given to Ukraine, and Kharkov was made the capital of Ukraine at that time. So what about those areas? Now, my understanding is that Putin is willing to sacrifice those to actually leave Odessa and Kharkov Ukrainian under one condition, that the 4 provinces plus Crimea are internationally recognized as Russian territory in a treaty, so that it becomes legitimate, not just a frozen conflict like North and South Korea or whatever Estonia used to be under Soviet times, unrecognized. I think that that's what he's willing to do, that leave Ukraine with access to the sea. Another very interesting and very, very difficult issue to resolve would be the size of Ukrainian army. The Europeans are encouraging Zelensky and the Ukrainians to have a 1 million strong army that would be a bulwark against Putin aggression, blah, blah, blah. But the Russians actually say, no way. This is called demilitarization. Ukraine should be neutral and it should be demilitarized, which means there should be a limit on its armed forces. Probably like Germany was after World War II, 100,000, 200,000, something like that. So that's demilitarization. And the next item that would be difficult to negotiate, but it's also extremely important for the Russian public opinion. Russian language should not be banned. It should be officially recognized as one of the official languages, just like in Crimea. Even though Crimea is Russian, Ukrainian is considered official second language in Ukraine that you could do business in, just like Spanish in the United States. So no oppression of Russian speakers, equal status, and a certain degree of autonomy for the Russian-speaking areas such as Kharkov and Odessa. If these things are ironed out, I think peace is feasible and possible. And from the Witkoff comments, it seems to me that Trump is on the same wavelength. It seems to me that it is possible if they agree and iron out these difficult issues.
I guess it goes without saying that added to this would be obviously no NATO membership for Ukraine.
Oh yeah, that goes without saying. Absolutely. Yeah.
So, but the problem with that is that Western assurances on matters like this don't seem to be worth a lot over the years, because there have been a lot of assurances about eastward expansion of NATO that have gone by the boards and that have been dismissed as mere verbal assurances, as if an honorable person would say, I gave you merely a verbal assurance, so of course you shouldn't have taken it seriously. So that's a problem, is that how can maybe you can trust the current administration. Can you trust the next one?
It's not a matter of trust. It's a matter of what I think the Russians mean, and it's not just Putin, but many people. The model is, and Colonel McGregor also, the model is Austrian neutrality treaty. Austria was not free to choose which way it wants to be in NATO or not in NATO. It was decided that it would be by constitution, by international treaty, a neutral country. It cannot join NATO. It cannot, because there's a treaty. And if they violate the treaty, they violate their own constitution. That's what I think that Putin and other Russian speakers and commentators and the generals want. There's to be an international treaty that recognizes these 4 provinces plus Crimea. In Russian, Ukraine is declared neutral, and that Russia as a signatory, that is a security guarantee, because the Russians take it upon themselves that they recognize it as a neutral state in such and such borders. So that matters, I think, much more than simply, a promise of such and such an administration that can change in 4 years and so forth. I think that's what probably that's what the Russians are demanding in these negotiations that are going on right now. And I think also for Ukrainians and for Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government, the treaty, internationally the treaty that is signed by all the European countries and the United States and Russia is a much better guarantee than some membership in NATO, because in NATO, even though they all boast about Article 5, if you read it attentively, it doesn't commit NATO to automatically go to war. It implies consultations and aid and this and that, but it doesn't automatically mean that all of NATO goes to war if if some military confrontation occurs. But an international treaty with a treaty status that does much more than just a promise, a hollow promise.
I've taken a couple of trips to Iceland in the past couple of years, and while I was on a walking tour, my tour guide said, "Oh, those are some American troops over there, and they're keeping us safe from Putin." And I thought, of all possible things that he could have an interest in, this frozen rock in the middle of nowhere is probably safe. But it made me think, I guess part of the reason that so much of the European public wants to keep prosecuting this is that they have, if my tour guide in Iceland is afraid that the Russians might invade, I bet a lot of Europeans feel like the Americans have just got to stop this problem from getting worse. And the way they do that is by making a strong stand in Ukraine.
I think it's all manipulation and fear. Fear is a very funny thing. There's no reason to have fear, but people still have fear. Some people have fear of the dark. Some people have fear of the dogs. It's laughable when I think about it. Russia is not going to invade Iceland, but that's not going to convince anybody. They say that Poland and the Russian neighbors have a legitimate reason to be afraid of Russia because of Russian aggression. Which aggression? Where was the aggression? The only one that I can think of, which was an aggression, was the Finnish War of 1940. And the Russian-Finnish War was basically that Finland used to be a part of the Russian Empire, and Stalin could have had all of it if he wanted to, but he didn't. He offered the Finns to move their border by 300 kilometers from St. Petersburg, because the border was, which is today actually a neighborhood in St. Petersburg. It was very, very close. Even in those days, it was a matter of like 10 minutes on a tram to the old border. And I know it very well because I lived in my youth over there. So Stalin offered them. They refused. He offered them 3 times more territory in the north, and they refused. And then there was a war, and a lot of Russian dies, and they won. And when they won, did they go to Helsinki? No. They just settled it with moving the border to 300 kilometers. That's the only time when the Soviet Union actually attacked in Soviet times any of its neighbors. Whereas, one shouldn't forget, during World War II, Hungarian troops, Romanian troops, the SS division composed of the Ukrainians and of the Latvians, they all, and the Romanians and Italians and the Spanish division, they all fought in Russia. They actually, in their uniforms, helped Hitler and fought in Stalingrad. And yet, the war is over, everybody's forgotten about that. Poland, of all places, now if you look at the map of Poland, at least a third of it, maybe close to a half, was given to it by Comrade Stalin. Given to it. It was taken from Germany and given to Poland. And as Stalin put it in those days, to compensate Poland for the injuries of the past. And what injuries was it? Well, it was the 18th century when Poland was divided, and not just between Russia. It was Russia, Prussia, and Austria. In other words, if the Poles are so much afraid of Russia, why aren't they afraid of the Austrians and the Germans, who also participated just as much in the division of Poland of 1791? So, fear is something that is natural for humankind, but I think now it's exploited by those people in the European Union who want to make money. Von der Leyen, she wants to be the big boss of a big European armament program with $800 billion. This is why they're saying Russia is going to attack. Russia is to be feared. Russian war is inevitable. It's just to make more money and power. That's as old as the world.
I don't know what to make of this dual claim. On the one hand, I hear people saying, no, look, the Russians are really on the ropes. They are in danger of, if not losing, then at least taking tremendous damage. They're very weakened. And so now is not the time to let up. Now is the time to press forward in Ukraine, but at the same time, while I'm on the one hand being told about the great vulnerability of Russia, I'm also told that if we don't do that, Russia's going to march into Poland. But it can't do that if it's as weakened as I was just told it was 5 minutes ago. So I have that issue. The second thing is, it's not obvious what the path to victory is for the anti-Russia, whatever coalition, the European powers that want to support Ukraine. It's not obvious what the path to victory is. So simply persisting in what they've been trying means only more death. That's all it means. And I think that's what Trump is trying to say, is that I want to stop all this death. Because simply persisting in the status quo, what could that mean other than more death? So what is it that the European powers think they can accomplish here on the battlefield as opposed to the negotiating table?
I already started on this note, is that the reason the Europeans don't want the end to this conflict is because they're afraid to lose power and to lose influence. But in terms of Russia, weak or strong, let me say a couple of words about that. Russia is very strong. In fact, it's stronger now than it was in 2022 because the Russian arms industry just increased production 3, 4, 5-fold. And the reason that became possible is because this is not private enterprise system, but because they opened up all these conserved factories from the Soviet times that had nothing to produce. And now they're producing these tanks and airplanes and drones and whatnot. It's a very, very strong industrial base. But I want to say something. The way the Russians conduct this war is not the way the Israelis are conducting the war. You don't see any carpet bombings. You have a very, very careful army against army combat with a lot of casualties because of this new way of drones. Drones is like a machine gun during World War I. It was a weapon that just basically killed hundreds of thousands and nobody knew how to cope with it. Same thing with these swarms of drones that are now the new reality. And the casualties are serious. But there hasn't been any bombing of Odessa, of Kharkov, of Kiev. When they show in the news that Odessa was bombed, it's actually not Odessa. It's a port with the newly arrived Western military equipment, or it's some hotel where NATO officers were residing and something like this. But there's no carpet bombing. There's very, very careful attempt not to harm the civilian population. Now, if Russia has conducted the war the way the Americans conducted it in Germany in 1944, it was carpet bombing that destroyed cities after cities after cities with hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties, there'd be not much left of Ukraine. Russia has the firepower to do it, but they don't want to because half of Ukraine are the same Russians who the Russians want to be their own citizens. So this really shows that Russia is progressing slowly, not because it's weak, not because it's just on the ropes and can't cope, but because they really don't want to hurt the population and they want to move in ways that minimize civilian casualties. Now, about the Europeans, where I just last comment I want to make is that the Europeans, especially the British and the French, they act as if they are still great powers. And that has finished like maybe 100 years ago. They're no longer. I mean, I live in France. It's a nice country. It's a beautiful place to be. But France is not a global power anymore. I mean, what do they have? Some 22 Rafale airplanes that they're so proud that they have, and they've given 4 of them to Ukraine. That's nothing. Russia has 12,000 airplanes, fighter jets. Russia has 12,000 tanks. And the Germans maybe produce 200 in a year. I mean, there is just no comparison. Russia is the only country in the world that can militarily take on Russia is the United States or China. That's it. All of combined Europe, even if you combine the British and the French and the German and the Polish army, all of them together, they cannot confront Russia. That's the way things are right now.
Would you take a minute to walk through for people the value of your book From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin? in terms of the story that it tells and how it helps us understand a country that in some cases it seems like we're determined not to understand.
Yeah, I think what my book is different from several other very good histories of the Soviet Union that my colleagues, I know many of them personally. The way mine is different is that I try to show and to explain, and the job of a historian is to explain that Russians changed their identity. In other words, they changed the way they think of who they were, why they were, and where they're going. Now, in the United States, for the last at least 150 years after the Civil War, Americans seem to know who they are and where they're going. They are a democratic country based on a constitution, and they have American values, etc., etc. So Americans have this very clearly defined identity. The Europeans have a more difficult problem with identity because they used to have national identity, where French, where German, where English, and now they're kind of trying to create a European identity, which is a very long and difficult process because a lot of people don't want to have a European identity and still think of themselves as the French, the Italians, and the Germans. So what I'm trying to do is to show that Russia had a very, very dynamic or constantly changing nature of the country. It used to be Russian Empire, then it became the Soviet Union, then it became Russian Federation. And the reason I start in 2013 is that in 2013 it was a Russian Empire, and it celebrated 300 years of a Romanov rule. And it had a very specific identity of being the empire, non-national, but the biggest empire, continuous, unlike the British. And the mentality was very much split against those of the peasants who spoke Russian and those of the elites who were very, very European. And their identity was to be as much European as possible. So the more things are in Russia, like in France, the better. This was the worldview of Russian elites in 1913. And then I go period by period by explaining how things changed and how slowly and painfully the Bolsheviks tried to introduce the identity of a new Soviet man and a new Soviet woman, and how nothing came out of it in the 1920s. And very little came out in the 1930s, where the majority were still peasants, and they were still Russian, and they were totally confused, and they didn't understand what the Bolsheviks were trying to say. What is proletariat? What is communism? They had no clue, and they had a very hard time dealing with this superimposed Bolshevik communist identity. And then it came another fundamental change, World War II, or the Great Patriotic War. This is the time when the Soviet official identity and the Russian identity merged. This was because so much suffering and so much combat that indeed the Soviet regime became legitimized in the eyes of the Russian people. This is the fusion of the two, the official communist, and communist was no longer meant like it is in the West. Communist is struggle against capitalist exploitation, for the workers, against the owners, none of that. Communism began to mean something else. Communism became almost like patriotic, like for new Russia, for our Russia that the Germans wanted to destroy. So the meaning of the word, even though the word remained, the meaning of the word became different. It was no longer communist like it used to mean. It was like Soviet patriotism. And this period lasted for 1950s and 1960s and 1970s. That's it. The period when there were people who considered themselves Soviet people. They really had that identity, meaning that they're patriots, that they love Russia, that Soviet Union consists of 15 republics, and we're all brothers, and you can be a Kazakh, and you could be Ukrainian, you could be a Latvian, but we all are in the family of nations called the Soviet people. And there were people who actually believed it, many, many people, the majority. But then there were the dissidents and the intellectuals who said, no, that's not for us, but they were a minority. And then begins a new period when this pro-Soviet identity is discredited and it is slowly kind of gives way to two new identities, which I describe in the book. One is a pro-Western one, which is westernizers in the tradition of Russian westernizers of the 19th century. The more we are like the West, the better. And the other one is a Slavophile tradition where the Russians think, no, we don't want to be like the West. We are different. This is like Solzhenitsyn, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, a very Russian tradition of being separate and different. And at first, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was the victory of the westernizers, people who wanted to be like the West. The West missed its huge opportunity when Russia wanted to embrace the West, when Russia wanted to be like the West, when Americans were the best brothers, 1990s. This was the time the West, instead of embracing Russia and as a friend, as a partner, as an equal, the West decided to expand NATO and to pump money out of Russia and to support the oligarchs. And it discredited the idea of a westernizers completely. And when Putin came to power, you have a slow and steady rise of a Slavophile tradition, of the Russian national tradition, which says we don't want to be like the West. No, the more we're different from the West, the better. The Western things are not for us. And what contributed to this even more is the woke culture, all this stuff that's connected with the sexual identity and the racial identity. All that stuff is totally unacceptable. And the way we're moving in Putin's years is away from the West. And I call it in my book the parting of the way, which happened even before the Ukrainian war. The parting culturally and politically and economically and in terms of its own identity away from the West. That's the reality we face today. And I don't think it's going to change, even if there is a good relations with the United States for a few years or maybe for longer. But Russians have already turned away from the West in their hearts. And when they see the German tanks being supplied to Ukrainians, this is like a red flag to the bull. That generates hatred. The Germans didn't get enough the last time they went into Russia with their panzers. It really is very stupid of the German government to send billions of aid to the Ukrainians who use their equipment to fight the Russians in the same place, in Kursk. So that's the kind of... and the last thing I want to say on this is that generally, the Russian people have always been very friendly to the United States. Very friendly throughout the periods of what I'm talking about. And I give you one example. If you came up to a Russian peasant or very common man in 1960s and said, what do you think about the United States? He would say, I would always remember whose can of food I ate in the trenches of World War II. It was American food. It was American cans that came to Russia and were distributed by millions to the Russian soldiers. And they remember who gave them the food during the war.
Well, thank you for that overview. I hope people will check out your book. Do you have any final words?
Yes, I'd like to, what I would like to finish on kind of a reassessment of Putin. He's been in power for 25 years. And the obvious question is, he will retire sooner or later. He's in his early 70s. Maybe he'll be in power for another 5-6 years, but there will be a time when he retires. And the question obviously is, what is his legacy and how will he remembered? And so my kind of judgment on him is that he's the greatest Russian ruler since Alexander II, a great Russian reformer czar in the middle of the 19th century. Maybe even as great as Catherine II or Peter the Great. I will call him Vladimir the Great or Vladimir the Savior, because he took a country that was completely in ruin, completely in a kind of a mess of corruption and crime and collapse of anything one could think of in the 1990s. And he rebuilt it carefully, step by step. He made it a great country, economically, politically, spiritually, everything. Russia is now a proud, sovereign country one of the very few truly sovereign countries in the world. And I think to a large extent, it is the leadership of Vladimir Putin.
Well, that might raise a little little controversy here and there, but what would be the point of the Tom Woods Show if we weren't doing that? Dr. Brovkin, thank you so much for your time and for all the great lectures that I got from you in those old days and our old stomping grounds at Harvard. I appreciate that.
I appreciate having a chance to speak to you again. Thank you very much.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of the Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.